Hi everyone, I'm Sue Stacy, and this series is called In Conversation because it's just that. It is recorded conversations with leaders and innovators in our field of early childhood education that has provided inspiration for myself as well as other educators over the years. And today I'm happy to welcome Dr. Christine McLean, who is the chair of the Department of Child and Youth Study at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Welcome, Christine.
Oh, thank you, Sue. This is really a pleasure.
Thanks for making the time. I know you're super busy. It's
It's
that
that
time.
time of year.
It's that time of year at the college level,
That's
right?
right. Yeah.
So Christine and I have collaborated in many ways over the years, including course design, and we belong to the same community of practice, where we have all sorts of heated conversations with our group and all sorts of ideas. It's a lot of fun. So naturally, we've had many conversations about how the field of early childhood education has changed over the years. And so, Christine, we've both worked with new, beginning students right from the
hmm
get-go and seasoned educators over the years in terms of professional learning. And our field, as we talked about, is in a constant state of flux. Everything always changing, very dynamic, which is a good thing. We don't want it to be stale.
Right.
But new ways of thinking and learning about everything, about what we do and how we do it. So, um, if we think, like, first of all, about the theory behind what we do, and what is actively sort of being introduced at the college level, what do you think have been the biggest changes over the years in what's being taught at the college level? You've seen it all.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to say before we started, I just realized that there's some construction happening in the office next to me. So if
Oh,
you hear
okay.
any drill sounds, it's some they're hanging up pictures or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, so change. I've been involved in the field since 1988, in the post-secondary ECE field, which, oh my gosh, that's a long time ago. And then, working, with children and so on in various capacities prior to that. So when I think about when we first started in this, and it was such a prescribed approach to working with children,
Yeah.
right? That we had our themes and we
Mm.
had, early childhood educators, and even just the term early childhood educator was only just being, started to be introduced around that time, right?
Yeah.
That we started looking at, the importance of the early years as being a time when children were educated, and so there was a lot of emphasis, I think, on children's cognitive development
Mm.
and a lot of a sense that unless we were teaching children, they weren't learning. And so the onus was on us as educators to have our lesson plans and our themes and to have our own agendas when it came to how we set up the room, what activities we planned for children, and so on. And that stuck around for quite a while. That was something that people were comfortable with, I think, because
Mm.
it fulfilled their idea of what a teacher was or what an educator was.
And it
And then we
feels it
started,
feels safe, it
it
feels
feels
safe
safe.
when you know what
And
you're going to be doing. Yeah.
exactly, and there would
Mm.
be, people would take a couple of weeks in August and plan for the whole year, right? They'd have their lesson plans and their themes, and
Mm.
I used to say it was like, I called it a Hallmark curriculum because you could walk in a Hallmark card store and you'd
Yeah.
know what theme was happening in
Yes.
the in an early childhood
Yes.
classroom, like
Yeah.
it's pumpkins, or it's
Yeah.
you know St. Patty's Day for some reason was, things like that.
Yeah.
And so then we started thinking about, and thanks to you and other educators, really looking at emergent curriculum
Mhm.
and what that is. And that was hard, in my experience, that was hard for people to wrap their heads around.
Yeah.
You know, they they
What do you
thought,
think? What do you think was hard about that?
I think trying to determine, in fact, what children were interested in,
Mm-hmm.
because we were supposed to build on children's interests.
Yeah.
And so, to let the curriculum emerge from children's interests. And so that was difficult for a lot of people because they
Mhm.
weren't able to determine, well, how can I tell what they're interested in? Or they don't seem to be interested in anything. you know.
Or
And
everything.
so,
Or
or
everything.
everything, they're
Yeah.
interested in everything. And so we really had to start thinking about our relationships with children
Mm,
and our images of
mm,
childhood and images of children. And I think that's one of the biggest changes that
mm,
came about. You know, when we first introduced, and I know I was working in Newfoundland and Labrador at the time, working with the provincial government when we started talking about emergent curriculum. And I probably didn't explain it very well either because I had limited understanding of it, right? And there was an outcry. You know, I was in developing policies around what the practice would look like and talking about emergent curriculum. And people thought it just was another word for chaos or anarchy,
mm.
right? You know, that we just throw everything we know out of the window and we don't use our themes anymore. And now we just have to, follow the interests of the child. And so it was really difficult and there was some backlash. And when I look at it, I think, oh, we could have done that differently. We could
I
have done
think
the
I
introduction.
remember.
Do
I
you
think
remember
I,
that?
well, I think I remember. I don't personally remember that sort of period of time when you were in Newfoundland, but I
Right.
remember Carol Ann Ween telling
Yes.
me that you were so enthusiastic and so behind this and so sort of gung ho, and you hit this sort of like brick wall. And
Oh,
yeah,
oh, it was
yeah,
so funny. And now I can say it was funny. You know, at
yes.
the time it was it was on the call-in radio shows. People were
Oh
calling
gosh.
up and saying, we're not allowed to teach ABCs anymore. We're not allowed to do one, two, threes. They that's how it was interpreted. And even there was a consultant who went around, providing pedagogical support. And I don't think we even used the term pedagogical support back
No, I
then.
don't think that word has
No,
even entered
that's
our
right. It
vocabulary.
hadn't
Yeah.
entered our vocabulary.
Mm.
And she went to a child care center and walked in, and the educator was doing a perfectly appropriate activity at the table with children using paper plates. But it was open ended. They could put whatever they wanted. They were doing collage type things on the paper plates. But when the consultant came in, the educator quickly put away the paper plates, and the consultant said, like, why? What's wrong? And she said, oh, well, I know we're not allowed to talk about shapes anymore, and these are all circles. And so
Yeah.
and I
Oh
thought,
yeah.
oh my gosh, what have we done and how is it interpreted? But it was more, trying to get away from the teacher directed approach
Yes.
where,
Yes.
children would have to recite all the names of colors and all the
Mm.
names of
Yeah.
the shapes and so on, these indeterminable 45-minute circle times where the teacher was, drilling the children on all these, so we
Yes.
were trying to get away from that. So I think that's one of the huge, like, seismic shifts
Yes.
was that change in power, change in hierarchy,
Mhm.
change in how we viewed ourselves as teachers, change in how we viewed children. And we're still working on that, I would
Yeah,
say.
it's been a long time that we've been working on that because, as you say, the interpretation of what it means is viewed so differently. Every person you speak to in early childhood sees that differently. And so I guess at the college level in these introductory courses, I think both at the Mount and at other
Hmm.
institutions across the province and across the country, we're seeing a great many more courses on play, for instance.
Yes,
And
yes,
play in many different sort of iterations, and we're using play with educators in our classrooms, in our college classrooms, and so that they can understand firsthand how this works,
right.
how children learn through play, but to be able to articulate that and really understand it. But as you
Yeah,
say, so many misinterpretations along the way. And
yeah,
actually, that's why I wrote my first book, because first of all, I wasn't seeing anything about emerging curriculum out there in book,
right.
and secondly, I saw all the misinterpretations, and of course, my books are my interpretation, and so
Right.
people are free to disagree with that, of course, but it's changed and grown a lot over the year, the whole idea of inquiry. So
Yeah.
so you mentioned themes and
Hmm.
predetermined outcomes and pre-planned, you know, for a year and all of that. So that's
Hmm.
as you said, that's like a seismic shift in
Hmm.
what we do and how we do it. Not so many people doing that anymore. Although people, you know, in various parts of the world, in the US in particular, the people I work with in the US do have to meet objectives for children that are, you know, we in the field would think, oh, you know, not so appropriate. Um, but those objectives and expectations are set by someone often outside of our field. You know, they're
Right.
set by
Yes.
administrators, director, you know, not directors of centers, but directors within government. Um, all sorts of people outside of our field are sometimes, you know, setting those expectations, not particularly here in Nova Scotia, but in other places around the world. So
Yes.
that's been a constant challenge. But in terms of practice, what do you see as the big shifts in what you're seeing come to light in practice? There is a child study center at the Mount, which
Yes.
you know you are you know involved with, and there's some wonderful work going on there, so you can see this firsthand. But what kinds of shifts are you seeing in practice that are maybe encouraging?
Yeah, yeah. And you're right. We have a wonderful child study center, and our director, Annette Camo, is just a marvel. You know,
Yeah,
what her passion and her vision and how she makes things happen is just, I'm always in awe when I go to the
yeah,
Child Study Center to see
yeah.
what's happening there. So I think one of the shifts is, well, first of all, we're talking about our image of the child more
Mm,
often, right?
yeah,
And I just wanted to, you know, our early learning frameworks,
yes.
they have been such a shift across the country. Not just in Nova Scotia, but literally across the country. And to see these amazing documents, I think that help to guide the practice of early childhood educators. And we're incorporating these into our classrooms now.
Yes.
That they're used as texts in some of our classes, and they really help to add that reflective practice component to what it is that we're doing. And again, that's not something that we talked about, 20 years
Yeah,
ago or 30 years ago.
that's a new expression, you know,
Yeah,
just in itself.
that's right.
Reflective dialogue.
Reflective dialogue, an internal dialogue,
Mhm.
as with early childhood educators, with colleagues, being reflective with children and encouraging, children to be reflective. That's all really new. And it's not easy. It's like a muscle that needs to be used, and so you get that muscle memory. And then, we could get into other, more political stances in terms of the early childhood educators, are they being given the proper time and preparation
Mm,
and support
yeah,
to be reflective, and to be responsive. And I think we're seeing more intentionality in why educators are doing what they're doing. Before it almost used to be like a rote automatic reaction. We put these materials here and these materials there, and this is how our day is structured, and that's what we do. And now it's becoming more flexible, more intentional, more responsive to, immediately responsive to what children's interests are, how they engage with the materials, what their theories are, which you talk about a lot. And I think that that's really been a good point for students and for educators to use those types of questions. What are the children wondering about? What are their theories? So those are the changes. Those are the things that I find optimistic, that I'm optimistic about, because I see the respect that comes with that, right? The
yeah,
respect for
yeah.
children, that we see children as having agency and being active participants in their learning. And we are starting to see ourselves as co-learners and co-constructors of knowledge, and not the ones who impart the knowledge,
Yeah,
right?
not the experts, but
Not the experts.
giving children the respect, you know, that it comes down to the image of the child, seeing children as being capable of having theories about
Right,
the world.
right.
I often say to students and to seasoned practitioners as well, you know, children have ideas about the world and how it works,
Mm,
but we just have to ask. We just
Right.
have to be listening.
Yeah.
They have theories about how everything works, and I mean they might be completely different than ours, but always there's logic, the way they see the world and then how they interpret that. There's a lot of logic to what they say if we're just listening, and a lot
Oh,
of
it just froze up
creativity.
on me.
Uh, a lot of
Oh,
create. Are you okay?
yeah, it just froze for a second there.
Okay. A lot of
Yeah.
creativity in the way that children think.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and we have to be open to that.
Yes, and I
Yeah,
think we have to be curious, right?
totally. Yeah.
There needs to be that curiosity, and we don't have to be, for example, when you said children have their ideas about the world, and they're not always the same as our ideas. When you think about their big questions, like how does that airplane stay in the air, or
Yeah.
how do this time of year leaves changing color, and we have to resist the urge to see that as a teachable moment,
Yeah.
right? Because then that shuts down the conversation. If we feel like we need to know all this and we need to talk about chlorophyll and photosynthesis and so on, then it aerodynamics. It shuts down that conversation and that your own curiosity about, well, what are their theories on this?
Yeah.
And so I think that's another big change, is not looking for the teachable moments necessarily. Now, there are going to be times that, there's something that you can't help but comment on or ask
Yes.
about, or,
Yeah.
or so on. But one of the things that we're telling our students is, when they're out on their practicum placements, is to hang back a little bit,
Hmm.
to be present and to be observing and to be wondering and to be documenting and to be taking notes, but don't feel like you need to be right in there
No.
directing the children's
Yes.
play. But where that gets to be problematic is, when people are being supervised in their practicum placements, and they feel that they almost need to perform, to show
Yes.
how
Yes.
how well I can do this. So they're not as comfortable with just sitting back while
Yes.
they're being observed. So
Well,
that's something I'm struggling right now
well,
with.
yeah, sitting back and observing is part of the pedagogy of listening, from
Yes.
Paulina Rinaldi and all the different ways that she suggested that we can listen. And when you're stepping back, you're not doing nothing. You're
Right.
very,
Exactly.
you're in your brain, hopefully, you're asking a lot of questions. And
Yes.
I say to students that 90% of the time when I'm watching children, I am so puzzled.
Yeah.
I'm puzzled and curious and about what they're doing. I don't immediately understand it.
Right.
And this actually is where pedagogical documentation comes in. For me, that has been a tool for
Yes.
understanding, because I can go back to it afterwards and I can talk about it with the children and I can talk about it with colleagues, and I might reach some understanding of the children's meaning, what they're doing. So I guess that's been a huge shift as well, the role of
That's a huge shift.
pedagogical
Yes.
documentation.
And I think it's been helpful in helping early child educators define their roles. Because if we take away from them, oh, you shouldn't be teaching and you shouldn't be, directing, and you need to be be that educator. We take that away, but we don't replace it. Well, then what am I supposed to do?
Yes,
Am I
the
just
role of the educator.
what's the
Yeah.
role of the educator? Am I just to stand back and let everybody play and then at the end of the day go home? And so I think that's something that educators have struggled with as well, when we're looking at that, to take away that. I keep on using the term hierarchy, but you know what I mean, where
Yes.
my role is to teach, and if I'm
Yes.
not doing that, I'm not
Yeah.
doing my
And I'm
job.
supposed to know. I'm
And
supposed to
I'm supposed
know.
to know
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so by talking more about pedagogical documentation as a form of research, for you, and a form of figuring it out and reflecting, and also trying to pull the children into that whole documentation process as much as possible too, then that gives the educator a clearer view, I think, and definition of how they can support children's experiences,
Yeah.
how they can support children's engagement. So I think that's been a really positive move, in terms of having educators see where they fit.
Yes,
right? In
yeah.
this, yeah,
And so
yeah,
when we talk about the image of the child with whoever we're working with, whichever adults we're working with, whatever point in their career, we should be talking about the image of the educator as well, because you know
yes,
those two things are completely intertwined. And
absolutely.
part of the whole, you mentioned walking alongside children and you know co-constructing and collaborating with them. And
Right.
these days, you know, I see emergent curriculum as more of a collaboration, which a conversation, which, you know, it's sort of a give and take, a conversation with children, a collaboration. Um, and another word that has come up, another, you know, change that we've seen in our field is reconceptualism. And
Yes.
you know that I have struggled somewhat with that word. You and I have had many conversations about
Yes.
what exactly that means. Um,
Yes.
so what is your understanding of reconceptualism?
Right. And
Where do what do you do with that, you know?
yes. And I'm still grappling with it as well, too. I'll tell you, it just goes to show, doesn't it, at where we are in our lives and in our professions that we're still learning.
Oh,
We're
always.
still,
Mm,
just when you think you know it all, somebody comes and turns it upside down. And I think
really?
that's the role of the reconceptualists is to
Yes.
turn it upside down, right?
Yeah,
And we have
yeah,
some great stuff happening here in Canada with
yes,
reconceptualizing early childhood. Some great leaders, Veronica Piscini Ketchaba and
yeah,
Kathleen Cummin and Iris Berger. A lot of stuff happening in British Columbia and
yes,
Ontario on that pedagogical support. And there is a website that's I have it pulled up here, Early Childhood Collaboratory.
yeah.
If people were to Google that, they'd see a lot about it. But I think it's reconceptualizing childhood and children. It's looking, I think the whole notion of image of the child is a part of reconceptualizing. I think the Reggio Emilia approach was really kind of
Mm,
the beginning of this reconceptualizing, where they saw children as citizens with rights. That just viewing them again, as I said earlier, as having agency and having a voice. And so thinking differently about the traditional ways that we've thought of childhood in the
mm,
past, it's also thinking differently about what approach we take in terms of child development.
yeah.
So the term that you'll hear in reconceptualizing childhood is developmentalism, where they're moving away from, they see taking a developmental approach to our planning and our thoughts and our images of children can be limiting
Oh,
in what,
absolutely.
right? And because there's children continually amaze me. And if I was to plan a lesson, or even using those terms, right, on what I think 3-year-olds should be doing or what I think 2-year-olds should be doing, according to some type of developmental lens, then I'm really missing the mark, because they are so beyond in a lot of cases, or just that these markers, these developmental markers, can become meaningless, right? Or they
Yes.
can become limiting. And so I think that that's what one of the things. Another thing is that reconceptualism really focuses on the importance of relationships
Yes.
and developing relationships, and seeing, not so much looking at children's individual progress, and assessing children's individual progress, but instead looking at their role in the community, as a collaborative engagement in the community, and not focusing so much on even using the term child-centered,
Yes.
it is something that, is a term that we've used often, and it just kind of drips from our lips. But, if you stand back and say, well, is that what we want? Really? Do we want it to be completely, our programs to be completely child-centered, or should they be more looking at the community of the children in the room? And so these are the things that make me think, that sometimes make my brain hurt. It also looks at not just children's relationships with people, but also children's relationships with the environment,
Yeah.
in all senses of the word, and their children's relationships with materials. And I think that's a big change that's happened in our field as well.
That has
Wouldn't you
been
say?
very interesting. And for me, I do a lot of work with educators on the environment and materials, and I've really bought into and love the idea of materials having agency, and you
Yes.
know that they send materials send messages to children, and when educators use those materials, they can understand that the
Yes.
materials are speaking to them, the environment
Yeah.
speaks to them. But I do enjoy the provocations that come out of
Right.
reconceptualism because it forces us to rethink, revisit, and I enjoy that. I enjoy seeing
Yes.
things through new lenses, and sometimes it does, as you say, some ideas, turn old theories on their head and cause a bit of
Yes.
disequilibrium. So,
Absolutely.
but
Yeah.
Betty Jones, the late Betty Jones would
Yes.
always say that disequilibrium is a good thing, and every profession should
Yeah.
have its disequilibrium and its
That's right.
provocations, and that's a learning
Yeah.
opportunity. And
Yeah.
just to
It's when learning happens.
yeah,
Yeah.
they at Pacific Oaks with Betty Jones when I was doing my master's, she would always talk about the edge, that disequilibrium takes you to the learning edge, and you can either step off that edge and feel,
Mm,
the disequilibrium, or you can stay safe, and
right.
of course encouraged stepping off of that edge,
Yes. Yeah.
the other side of the wall, as Loris Malaguzzi would say.
Right.
But
Right.
talking about that developmental lens and how restrictive it is,
Hmm.
how tight that developmental lens um, is completely sort of in opposition to how we think these days about, we want to get a much broader picture of the child. And I do say to students when they're first starting their journey with pedagogical documentation, and what they're going to document, I often throw them into a state of disequilibrium because I say, don't tell me about development. Like,
Don't tell me about their pincer grasp.
no, I don't. I
That's
don't. We know that we can see. We know that it's a given that these things are happening. These developmental
yes.
things are happening
Right.
within this moment or this activity. Tell me about the child's thinking. Tell me about the child's idea. Tell me about the child in relationship to their environment or their group, or
Yes.
between them and the adults, anything other than the developmental lens, because that's always been the default, it's
Yes.
been the default because, again, it feels safe. And so I
Yeah.
think we
And it's the
can,
little tick boxes, right?
yes,
Tick, tick,
yeah,
tick,
and
tick. And yeah.
we can move so far beyond that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, even thinking about the early learning frameworks across the country, I don't think any of them include any type of developmental checklist, right?
no, no, not
That's not
anymore.
the language that they're written in.
Yeah.
It's not the substance of what they're doing. Like, for example, in Nova Scotia, when we're talking about learning goals around children, there's nothing about developmental learning
No,
goals per
no.
se.
Thank
It's children's
goodness.
well-being, right?
Yes,
Children's discovery and invention, their
yes,
language and communication. And also the big one is their personal and social responsibility. Again, looking at children as part of a community and part of a collective.
yeah.
And so, and though our learning goals are very similar to the learning goals in the other frameworks across the country. So,
Yes, I'm happy to see that the learning frameworks across the country all really had the same foundational pillars.
yes,
They all
yes,
come from that place
yeah,
of the child as being, of the image of the child as being capable, competent, curious. And curiosity in educators is something that I'm trying to push, always advocating
yes,
for, to be able to raise questions rather than answers about what children are doing. We don't have to have the answers, but we do need to be able to ask the questions
right,
and
right.
push back against what we always we all have biases about what we think is going to happen in the block area or what we expect to see, but
Right.
to be open and flexible in our thinking about seeing through a more open lens and just
Yeah.
having a broad view of what's happening in early child classrooms. This is where lab schools and places like the Child Study Centre are so important. It's discouraging to me to see that lab schools across the country are sometimes closing because
Mm,
their colleges don't always support them.
right.
Um, but fortunately, around here we've got some really good lab schools, child study centers in Atlantic Canada, and they are so good at taking theory and helping students to understand it in practice. I mean, that's what they're there for, and they do it so well.
Oh,
Uh,
so true.
through adapting the environment, through documentation, or just the teachers' interactions and engagement with children, or not, the stepping back.
Mm,
It's so precious for students to be able to see that. So how do we, as educators of adults, people who walk alongside adults in their journey, I guess the question has to come up, how do we present these things, these new ideas, reconceptualist ideas, ideas about pedagogy in general, to our students in meaningful ways when we haven't actually, many of us who've been in the
hmm
field for decades, as you said at the very beginning of our conversation, these weren't our practices when we were trained as
No.
educators. We keep up with research. We work, with educators in the field. We have visitors come in. Um, how do we, encourage these new approaches or ideas when we haven't always experienced them ourselves? What keeps us, on the cutting edge?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's tricky. I was thinking when we were talking about reconceptualizing, maybe you and I are reluctant reconceptualists, but like initially, but
Initially.
yeah. Um, but all of everything that we're talking about is not easy,
Mm.
right? Like it's not getting back to what it was like, years and years ago when you had a prescribed curriculum approach. That was easy.
Yes.
You knew, and now, I mean, the profession itself is not easy. There's still going to be all kinds of things happening, but you didn't like the thinking part of it
Yeah.
wasn't as prominent as what it is now. And
Yes.
so I think that's what we're doing with our students, and also, like you said, with more seasoned educators, is trying to build that curiosity and that fascination of children. It's all about, we said relationships are important with children. Relationships are important with educators as well, too, right? Relationships with each other. We talk about communities of practice. We talk about having critical friends, as part of reflective practice. So I think that's one of the keys, is to acknowledge, yeah, I'm struggling with this. It doesn't make sense to me. It's not how I remember my childhood. It's
Mhm.
not, and that's a lot of times that's what people come to the profession with, their own memories of what it was like,
Of course.
to
Yeah.
in their own childhood. And so we're disrupting that. And so I think it takes patience, and it also is that building of relationships with the people that we're our students, and with their participants in professional development and or professional learning, and these communities of practice, to have these conversations, right? To acknowledge the discomfort, and to be comfortable with the discomfort. That, yeah, you're not going to know what questions to ask. You're not going to know, is this what they're talking about? Is that a theory? And in addition, there's all the practical components to the work, right? That you need to get, 16 kids in their snowsuits
Yes.
and
Yeah.
outside, and you need to have a snack prepared, and you need to, there's, all kinds of sand on the floor that needs to be cleaned up, right? So there's all those practical components. But I remember I was doing some research with some early childhood educators a few years back, worked with them over a 6-month period, asking them to co-construct documentation with children.
Yes.
So instead of it being a separate process. And one of the educators said to me, and she had been in the field for, a few decades, and because I had given them some reflective dialogue prompts to use with children, just to help out with, what are the questions to ask, because they don't automatically drip off our tongue,
Mhm.
right? Our questions that we're used to is like, well, how many are there? Or can you find the red ones? Or,
Mhm.
that type of thing. And so to have those more thought-provoking questions was tricky. So they had some prompts, and they were asked to, sit with a child and review their photos that they had taken of an experience with the child. And the educator said to me when we had our little debriefing session, she said, I've been in the field for, 25 years. This is one of the first times that I can remember having an authentic conversation with a child. And I thought, we both of our jaws dropped, her saying it and me hearing it, because I was thinking, well, what the heck have you been doing? You know, and so I
Mhm.
asked her, well, what the heck have you been doing then?
Yeah.
And she, because we had built a relationship, we could talk about this stuff. She said, I would ask, how was your weekend? I would say, how's the new puppy? Did you go and visit Nan and Pop? Did okay, it's time to put this away. Every time everybody is ready for snacks. She said, I talked with all the children, I knew all the children, but to sit down and have a conversation, like a 5 or 10 minute conversation with a child, she said, I felt like I wasn't doing my job if I did that.
Oh,
And that was another big surprise
yeah.
too. She said, because I felt it looked like I was taking a break with the child while the other educator had to do everything for all the remaining children
Mhm.
in the room. And so she said, I didn't feel like I could do that to my co-educator.
Wow.
And so now luckily her co-educator was also in this same project, so we could have the conversation together. And we said, okay, how about if you had this kind of relationship, and even just the eye contact that you'd make with somebody, like, I'm in a good conversation right now, and
Mm.
you know that you will also have the opportunity to do
Yeah.
that. And so let the other educator, make, be with the other children. And another thing that, if your room is engaging enough, you don't need to be with
No.
the children all
No.
the time.
Yeah.
So I think just having, those conversations about what does this look like on the floor, these things, but also giving the students, especially, and educators, and I know you do this in your workshop, and so do other great colleagues of ours like Liz Hicks and so on.
Mhm.
It gives the children, or the students, the participants, time with materials,
Yeah.
right? Time
Yeah.
to be doing this themselves, because they may not have ever had the opportunity to have just open-ended activities,
Yeah.
right? They may
Yeah.
not never have been asked, what's your opinion on something, right? So we need to be reflective with them, and have that opportunity, and let them be reflective, because we're assuming that all the educators have had these experiences with an inquiry-based approach themselves, when they may not have,
Oh no.
right?
And some
Yeah.
materials, you mentioned materials, some materials that are so sort of open-ended, loose parts, but
Yes.
materials like wire and
Mm,
real clay.
yeah.
Many educators have not had the opportunity to use those materials, and yet they are wonderful materials to use with children. So
Yes.
just access to the materials itself is eye-opening and provocative and promotes wonderful conversations. And when we talk about, people who are not used to this kind of practice or having these conversations with children, it makes me think of the importance of the role of the pedagogical leader and
Yes.
and how many centers and settings do not have a pedagogical leader, which is not the same as a director.
Right.
It's a completely different role. But there are handfuls of centers across the country, in North America, in general, that have pedagogical leaders. And oh my gosh, what a difference that makes to have
Yes.
someone who helps to carve out the time to have these conversations, to support documentation, to have conversations about documentation. And I know that the pedagogical leaders the pedagogistas in Reggio Emilia value and treasure those conversations around the documentation, the very raw, rough
Yes.
documentation that teachers have done because that's all they have time for. But to be able to have conversations with someone about that is huge. It really helps our process. And I think, for us, who have been in the field for a long time or are leaders in the field, and those people out there who are innovators across Canada, the idea of having a pedagogical leader for even two or three or four centers,
Yes.
under their jurisdiction, their umbrella, as they do in Reggio Emilia, would be a huge step forward, a huge
Yeah.
support for
Right.
educators who are
Yeah.
practicing in the way.
And there are some, I believe BC
Yes,
has put
yeah,
those types of pedagogical supports in place, whether it's something that will stay in place, or whether it's just a project right now. Ontario has some great
yeah.
examples of,
Alberta. Alberta
Alberta, yeah,
has had a
yeah,
long-standing
right,
system with pedagogical leaders, so they are out
yeah,
there, and
yeah.
I would just love to see that for every center,
Oh,
to even if
absolutely,
it's
yeah,
shared, if it's someone who is shared, the
right,
College of Early Childhood Education is just sort of piloting something like this with in Nova Scotia, with having somebody who, is in and out of centers
right.
to try and fulfill this role.
Yeah,
So
yeah, it's
that's a
so
huge support.
important.
Yeah,
Yeah, because it's a wonderful move in the right direction. I think we're going, but it needs to have that support, right?
yeah,
And that
absolutely.
acknowledgement that it's not easier. I think it's more fulfilling. I think
Yes,
it makes the profession, it lifts it up, and it's helping, children to see their role as being active and
absolutely.
capable, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we want for our kids.
Well, that's a great place for us to finish. That's what we want for our kids. We could talk all day about this.
We could,
We
and we
do.
have.
We have talked all day about this many, many times.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Christine. I know this will be really useful for people. So thank you for giving your time.
Oh my gosh, you're so welcome. Anytime.
Okay, thanks, Christine.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.